The second set of questions were posed in a 1 to 5 scale format. I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the findings from those. So 90% of participants believe that their dispositions either entirely or highly affected student perceptions of their class. In terms of the familiarity that the participants had with the sport education features, 40% were very familiar, another 40 were somewhat familiar, and the other 20 were either limited or not at all familiar. 70% of participants felt completely confident, however, in their ability to effectively implement sport education, and even crazier is 90% felt that sport education was extremely or highly effective in their own class. In terms of qualitative findings, 3 themes were constructed from the data analysis procedures, and the first one of those was player roles. This was determined to be the most beneficial sport education feature. The reasons for this that participants cited included promoting personal and social responsibility, peer teaching, student accountability, equal involvement, increased motivation. All of those were reasons, in addition to player roles being a particularly time-consuming aspect to effectively implement and continue to supervise. The second theme was formal competition. This was the most indicated as the most challenging sport education feature to implement, and the reasons for this included student tendency to display overly competitive behavior, as well as parental pressure in opposition to competition. And then the third theme was institution type. So the barriers that were determined to PE and to sport education were wildly disproportionate based on institution. In the public and charter the public and charter barriers included a limited time frame and play space, a lack of teacher support, large class sizes, habitual absences, and high sped integration. But for the private school participants, the only barriers that they put down were parental pressure, and one of them even said too small of a class size to implement sport education. So it's crazy to see the contrast there. So I believe the data successfully addressed each of the research questions, A, B, and C, very well, and then not so much D, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But in terms of the benefits of player roles across all the domains, 3 sources are there to support each of those domains. So for the psychomotor, Pritchard et al. In their study, they found that sport education produced superior volleyball game performance versus the traditional model. From a cognitive aspect, Schwamberger and Kirtner-Smith indicated that pure sport education increased student understanding of what moral sporting behavior entails. And then from a social perspective, Romar et al., even though teachers each implemented sport education in a different way, they unanimously agreed that player roles increased social cohesion in their classrooms. In terms of challenges to formal competition, the current study cited overly competitive behavior and parental pressure as the main issues, and the literature provides a potential solution to each of these. The first one from Hasty and Hasty et al. Was a study on different student groupings, and they found that mixed skill level groups it put lesser skilled students at a disadvantage, and it also decreased the efficacy of the higher performing students at the same time. Whereas when student groupings were based on skill level, they benefited the majority of female participants as well as nearly all of the lesser skilled students. And they cited observed increases in performance, positive behavior, motivation, engagement, all during competitive gameplay. On the other hand, a potential avenue that a different study said might be able to limit parent pressure against the idea of competition was made evident by Fernandez and Burnaby Martin and they did a study in which a social media intervention via Facebook for sport education was shown to significantly increase parental involvement and parental understanding of the sport education structure, including that of competition. Um, so that's interesting. And then the idea of disproportionate barriers by institution was indirectly supported by a couple of sources. It should be noted that these barriers are subject specific and not sport education specific, so they're going to apply to whatever is being taught in the classroom. So, for example, Zhu et al. The study was done in an urban public school setting. That there were heavy time constraints placed on the participant, and he was not able to implement the constructivist model fully to his liking, despite having the dispositions to do so. And then the second source, Krupis et al. They basically found that an environment that has poor facilities is going to usually reflect teacher dissatisfaction and burnout compared to teachers that are in environments with better condition of facilities. And then finally, for dispositions and perceptions, the survey data was not able to establish a relationship between these two. However, the influence of dispositions as a whole was a big theme in the literature. The first similarity between my study and another one from Denahan and McPhail was that even though both of our populations had participants that were lacking in a thorough sport education background understanding and experience, that I'm sorry, yeah. So for both, they lacked thorough sport education experience and understanding, and the researchers noted that that proper sport education exposure is absolutely vital and crucial for consistent and reliable data. And I was looking at my results, and I was seeing kind of I wasn't so sure that certain things were reliable. So there was a huge connection there to that. And then while this may suggest that the data is flawed to a certain degree, get this: there's a second similarity between my study and a different one from Romar et al. And it actually expands further on this idea. In this, so despite inexperience in both populations for sport education, the participants overwhelmingly still perceived the model as being effective, even though it may have been based on a incomplete or flawed understanding on their part. So that's really interesting. And then just to wrap it up, the three conclusions that were established from the above interactions were that sport education is widely perceived as effective, independent of specific demographics or barriers. So the ones in the public school thought sport education was just as effective as the ones in private schools, even though obviously the barriers were very different. Second, effective sport education implementation is not one size fits all. It's going to look a little bit different depending on the classroom it's being implemented in. And finally, effective sport education delivery is dependent on the dispositions of the physical educator. They need to believe that that the model is right, that it's good, that they got to love it, and they got to be invested in it, and they got to be willing to persist. All of those things are crucial to effective implementation. So this study was highly beneficial for 4 different groups of PE professionals, and especially all of those who were unfamiliar with what sport education entails and its benefits. For current physical educators, because they're responsible for making effective classroom decisions right now, and they don't really have time to sit down and overhaul their curriculum, I recommend for them that they would evaluate individual aspects of sport education and see if there are any that they would consider supplementing in their own curriculum that would be applicable. For example, adding in a system of player roles to establish higher standards for personal and social responsibility. For prospective educators, unlike current educators, they are not in a position where they need to make effective classroom decisions right now. And because of that, they should take advantage of the opportunity to learn more deeply about sport education and to develop ideas and instructional blueprints for future application. And then for the administrators of PE teacher education programs, um, the implications of this study are far greater than for the actual teachers themselves, just because of the fact that these administrators are in a position to facilitate changes that are going to impact the next future generations of physical education teachers. And so, based on that, I recommend that they would consider expanding sport education within the program structure that they've got going, whether that means designating certain units to it or emphasizing curricular instruction in general, but just kind of finding a way to make connections with that more. And then in the same way, the professors, they're in the same boat, if not more, in terms of shaping the future direction of PE, of the field. And so I recommend that they would collaborate with administrators. They would talk about sport education and curricular instruction specifically in class, and they would make those connections where applicable. And then going along these lines, calls for future research. One of them is to study PE teacher support, the amount that they have currently, their perceptions on the support that they get, and potential improvements to increase support in the future, because that's going to be necessary for effective model implementation. And then finally, increased sport education integration in PE teacher education programs, and finding the dynamics that can facilitate this process and make it a reality. So coming to the end right here, references. I used 24 sources. I took a look. 18 of these were research studies. 1 was a meta-analysis. 3 were books. 1 was a web source, and 1 was a professional presentation, and that was Daryl Seidentop back in the day, of like doing a presentation like I am right now to a big committee of people when he first introduced the concept of sport education, which is really cool. And then finally, acknowledgments. I want to dedicate this presentation and this project as a whole to my former teacher, mentor, and coach, Mr. Cook. He's the biggest reason for why I am in this field. And then just a huge shout out to Professor Alstott for everything that he's done, all the hours of hard work, not only for me but for all the classmates. So thankful for that. Thankful for my parents and for my master teacher. I'm thankful for a couple of the owners over at a place where I did a ton of my work for this project at. They're all very important in different ways. And last but not least, I want to just give a shout out to Riverside Middle School in Newcastle, Colorado, because they gave me opportunity. They hired me on, and I've got a great opportunity ahead of me to actually put into practice some of the things that I've had the opportunity to research in depth. So I'm so thankful for that. So thank you all for tuning in to the presentation, and glory be to God.